So, good morning. It's an honor to be here. I will try and be somewhat interesting anyway. So I have no financial disclosures. Turns out there's not a lobby for this. This is more properly intimate partner violence than domestic violence, but I'm kind of a dinosaur and I tend to use those terms interchangeably. Dr. Kokenauer is the chair of the Best Practice Guidelines Committee on Abuse for the American College of Surgeons. And her leadership has been great in that effort. And she's trying to make me better, honest. So much of this is evidence-based. I will deviate from political correctness. I say that because I'm at the University of California and I'm supposed to be politically correct, and I'm sorry, I just can't be. It's not my intent to offend anybody. On the other hand, I have no apologies to make. So the question comes up, what's a guy doing talking about domestic violence? And I had a brief sojourn at the University of South Florida. To keep your license in Florida, you have to have at least 2 hours of continuing medical education a year on domestic violence at that time, or IPV. The guy that gave it was Ron Ches, neat guy, OBGYN, and he talked about his index case. He'd gone to a meeting, national meeting for OBGYN, and he'd been challenged by the speaker, the whole audience, to go home, ask somebody in your practice, and Ron admits to thinking this is ridiculous, and so he went back to his practice, and he asked a woman in his practice who he figured his safest patient. He'd known her for over 20 years. He'd delivered 3 of her children. He knew her quite well, he thought. And he asked her about domestic violence, and she said, last week wasn't bad. He only hit me 3 times. And so he was stunned, and it made a big impact on me. I went out and made rounds on the trauma service thereafter. And when reevaluating through a different lens, I had a woman that had been beaten up by her boyfriend, a woman that had been stabbed by her boyfriend, a guy that had been run over by his fleeing girlfriend. And probably 30 to 40% of my floor service had some component of intimate partner violence in it. Ron likes to say everybody's got their own index case. This is mine. So divorced woman, graduate student, married another grad student. Verbal, physical, and psychological abuse. Showed up in an emergency department with multiple rib fractures. And she was asked by the nurse, did somebody hit you? Did somebody do this to you? But the guy was standing right there next to her, so she, of course, said no. Subsequently, she was hospitalized for facial reconstruction surgery after an incident, but was never subsequently screened for intimate partner violence. Eventually got divorced. He found a younger woman, and she survived. So domestic violence among women of childbearing age is estimated to be the leading cause of serious injury, second leading cause of injury and death. The rate was described as greater than that of motor vehicle crash and mugging combined by C. Everett Koop. And this goes back years. And again, full disclosure, I do not routinely read the Harvard Law Review. And came from research this. But when you see your wife commit an offense, do not rush at her with insults and violent blows. Scold her sharply, bully, and terrify her. And if this still doesn't work, take up a stick and beat her soundly. For it is better to punish the body and correct the soul than to damage the soul and spare the body, not in rage, but out of charity. And concern for her soul, so that the beating will rebound to your merit and her good. Are you kidding me? Again, I'm going to editorialize. So the origins for this talk, the rule of thumb, it's a common expression, a rule of thumb, and everybody assumes it's an approximation or something from the textile injury or carpentry, and in fact, no. It is from a judge's proclamation that you could beat your wife if you did it with a stick no thicker than your thumb. Ever use that one again? So British law explicitly upheld the right of a man to beat his wife, and it was reiterated as recently as a century ago. We're not a whole lot better in this country. It took us a long, long time to make it illegal to beat your spouse. And furthermore, until the 70s, If you beat up your spouse, it was more likely going to be charged as a misdemeanor, whereas if you'd beat up your neighbor or the congressman who's mowing his lawn next to you, sorry, it would have been a felony. Yeah, again, I'm not politically correct. So the joint has decided that all hospitals need policies and procedures on how to manage this, and appropriately so. So there are a bunch of different definitions, and some of the research in this field has been hampered by different definitions. This is a pretty good one and has some advantages. It covers all forms of abuse, verbal, psychological, physical. It covers prior and current relationships, and it makes no differentiation about same-sex couples or hetero couples. So physical is most likely what's reported. It's about 25%, at least according to the Centers for Disease Control in 2000. And there are a bunch of myths that go around this, and you've probably heard them or perhaps seen them in print. It's infrequent. Certain women. Batterers are easy to identify. They're different, you can tell. It's private. It's caused by drinking and drugs. It's not a crime. Women are responsible somehow for their beatings, which really annoys me. And a battered woman can just leave. And then once a victim, always a victim. So let's talk about some facts. While I'm speaking, there's a woman being beaten in this country every 9 seconds. You guys can do the math. There's no distinction for age, race, culture, status, class, education, religion, and I'll get into that in more detail later. I gave this talk at the Medical College of Virginia, and a woman stood up and said, "My best friend died last week." Her husband and she were in marital counseling. Her son, her teenage son, went to their psychologist and said, "I'm worried about mom because dad just bought a shotgun." And the therapist said, "Don't worry, Jewish men never kill their wives." 2 days later, she was shot down in the parking lot of her employer, which happened to be the Central Intelligence Agency. So for women, there is a 54% cumulative lifetime risk of being battered. I have a 20-year-old daughter. This offends me and it scares the hell out of me. And about 30% for men. Child abuse occurs in about 59% of wife abuse families. I'm going to mention that more later. Battering increases in severity and frequency over time, and it gets worse after leaving. So to the people that say, well, why don't they just leave? Because your chance of dying goes up significantly when you flee, if you get caught. There's a woman that worked in the medical staff office at our hospital for some period of time. She'd been beaten repeatedly by her husband. She'd always said something else had happened, and she finally showed up in an ED with a mild concussion, and they asked her, and she spontaneously beat me up. Husband was arrested, taken to jail. He got out, and as she put it, wiped the floor with her. She left. She fled. And for 2 years, he stalked her, trying to find her, to the point where she would not tell her parents where she was living. So she had to divorce her entire life, all her friends, all her family, to hide from getting murdered. That's why they don't spontaneously leave. So 55% of female homicides associated with IPV. Over half the women that die in this country are murdered by somebody they've been intimate with. Think about that. 5-fold higher if there's a gun in the home. Battering is associated with about 25% of women trying to kill themselves. And I will say up front, the LGBTQ community is understudied. Pretty sure the rates are higher, especially in the transgender community, but there is significant lack of good research in this area, and we're working to try and make that a little bit better. So I'm going to put up this slide. This comes from our friends at the Department of Justice. And you can look at this and go, wow, it dropped 63%. We're doing great. Right? You'd be happy with a 63% reduction in complication rate after surgery. I would be. So then this happened. And I don't have the video anymore because I don't like to show it. But this showed a one-punch knockout of a woman in an elevator and then dragging her out and kicking her legs out of the elevator. Within days of this story breaking, there were, and it says spiked, 800% increase in calls to the National Domestic Violence Hotline. 800%. But there's a 63% reduction. So women of all races are equally vulnerable. 5.3 million women a year experience a serious assault. 4 to 5 women murdered every day by husbands or boyfriends. Every day in this country. 1 in 3 women has been beaten, coerced into sex, or otherwise abused during their lifetime. So this is, again, an area, because I now have a daughter that's out of adolescence, but 12% of high school girls report physical abuse while dating. 16% report sexual abuse by a dating partner. 1 in 3 report knowing a peer that's been hit, punched, slapped, choked, or physically hurt. And interestingly enough, when you survey adolescents and high school kids, they say if their friend was hit by their boyfriend, abused in some fashion, they would tell somebody. They would tell a counselor, they would tell a teacher, they would tell the friend's parent. They would do something to protect their friend. 17% actually do. So abused girls are significantly more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. Lots more likely to get pregnant, lots more likely to try and attempt suicide. You want to do something about suicide in this country? Do something about IPV. So this was described back, if I remember right, in the Journal of the American Medical Association, the so-called cycle. So the first phase is tension building, name calling, maybe some mild physical abuse. Second phase is the discharge phase with the physical attack. And then third phase, this is not from JAMA, this is my sarcastic look at it. Hearts and flowers. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. It's been really stressful at work. Something bad happened, and it'll never happen again. And of course, there's a tremendous amount of investment in the relationship, you want to believe, and so things may occur. After the last several really public episodes of this, there was a whole set of the usual recriminations. Well, why don't they just leave? And so there was a whole meme called "And So I Stayed." And so I'll let you guys read this, because you read better than I do, or at least as well, and me reading slides to you is kind of dumb. Friends and clergy didn't believe me, and so I stayed. You can go through the whole list of whys, and this is just some of them. So there's a second cycle associated with this, and it belongs to us. In one study of women that showed up in an emergency department, 23%, 6 to 10 visits prior to the diagnosis being made. And 20% had been there 11 times before the diagnosis was made. And this is an old reference, but it's still true today. Think about it. If your car was having problems and you took it to the same shop 11 times, you really going to continue to go there? We do a terrible job at this. I looked at this 10 years ago in our hospital, and at that time, the chairman of the Department of Emergency Medicine was married to the woman who was the executive director of the shelter in Fresno. One woman every day documented assault, including one woman where she admitted she had lacerations on both hands from her husband trying to cut her with a kitchen knife. Hands got sewn up and she got sent home with the same guy. Interestingly enough, she came into the trauma service about a year and a half later with a significant closed head injury, with the story that she fell off a ladder at home doing something, had a severe traumatic brain injury, and was discharged to skilled nursing in a chronic vegetative state. Wonder if we missed something. In this whole time, there were only 2 referrals for social service, 2. And of those 2, both were because the assault occurred in front of the children, and so they called CPS because they were worried about the kids. What kind of a message does that send? Care about you, but we're worried about your children. And no referrals to law enforcement. For those of you that do not know, California is a mandatory reporting state. So we suck. Non-trauma complaint. Now, diagnosis isn't always easy. They don't always say. Even after a violent episode, only about 23% will tell you what happened. Rarely volunteer, maybe 13%. And the obvious signs tend to be relatively rare. However, if you ask about abuse in a non-judgmental way, they'll offer up. They're not going to be offended. And failure to ask is perceived that you know and you just don't care. Interestingly enough, there was a survey done of women in shelters, and they asked who they liked the best or who they felt the most helped by. Social services, law enforcement, even the lawyers ranked above the doctors. There are some clues. Injury type and location, center mass. Head, chest, abdomen, center mass. Somebody that comes into you and says, I fell down the stairs, and they've got bruising only on their face, they didn't fall down the stairs. So how do we do this? Routine questioning, explicit without the partner present. And there are a couple of things. There's the partner violence screen, which is 3 questions. I'll go into that a little bit. Abuse assessment screen, 5. So the partner violence screen takes 20 seconds. 20 seconds to save a life. Have you been hit, kicked, punched, or otherwise been hurt by somebody in the last year? If so, by who? Do you feel safe now? Is there somebody from a previous relationship making you not feel safe? Doesn't take very long. This is the one that the Best Practice Guidelines group is going to recommend. It's called HITS. Any positive response is considered a positive screen. So does your partner physically hurt you, insult or talk down to you, threaten you, scream or curse at you? That's it. So if you look at the comparison, this is a family medicine clinic, OB intake. And what they found out is that versus talking to the social services person for an hour in a routine intake versus a screen, profoundly more successful to do explicit questioning in every category. So the incidence of intimate partner violence for those of you on the trauma service is increasing, and about 6% of your trauma mortality on an annual basis has something to do with IPV. Universal screening will make the diagnosis at least 2-fold more often than not doing it. So failure to make this diagnosis has some really bad consequences. In this study, 44% of the women that were murdered had presented to an emergency department within 2 years. They averaged over 3 visits per victim. 3 times, 3 shots at it to get it right and save a life, and we blew it. Injury documented in at least 90%. Another study, 11 cities, all of them women murdered by men. 81% had been abused within the year prior to being murdered. 72% had reported it. 66 had accessed the healthcare system. And the commonality between this study and the previous study is all the people they were studying had toe tags. So this is less than 2 weeks ago, right? This is a woman who graduated from UCSF Medical School, was a family medicine resident in Utah, and was murdered by her live-in boyfriend. So murder-suicide is not uncommon, 4 to 5 women per day. Included in this are the ones, the so-called family annihilators that wipe out parents, children, in-laws, you name it. So 57%, and I'm going to get a little bit more political, 57% of the mass shootings in the United States, 4 or more victims, were domestic violence related. Department of Justice said that if they looked at women who were murdered by a partner versus women who survived, still abused, but survived, 53% had a gun in the house of the ones that were murdered. 15% of the survivors had a gun. So how do you fix this? I don't know. I can tell you that of the things to decrease abuse on the part of the abuser, the thing that seems to be the most effective is leaving the scene in handcuffs. And I think that's probably great, maybe in the trunk. The idea of this is that you will reduce re-victimization, and it is your opportunity, perhaps, to plug the victim into the social safety net, to advocacy groups, to a different network. And hopefully it works. Having said that, incidence goes down for 6 months. Between 6 months and 18 months, it goes back up, and by 2 years, it's back to baseline level. So putting somebody in handcuffs works for a whole 6 months. This is not a long-term solution. So interestingly enough, 71% of the women who were bad or report that their pet was threatened, harmed, or killed by their partners. In fact, we had a woman who fled her abusive husband in Fresno, was at the local shelter. Husband rolled up with the family dog, a cardboard box, a rope, and a blowtorch. Put the dog on the box, put the rope around his neck, threw it over a tree branch, and was fixing to fricassee the dog in front of his wife and children to punish them for having left him. Fortunately, the police got there about that time. The dog was not harmed. I regret to inform you that the abuser was handcuffed rather than put on the box and torched. So, victims of domestic violence have increased use of medical care, prescription drugs, they've got high blood pressure and somatic complaints. In the emergency department, the so-called frequent flyer who has a headache, total body complaints, and she's been there a bunch of times for it, screen her for domestic violence. These folks are at increased risk of depression, PTSD, substance abuse, and suicide. So, quick question. How many of you are old enough to remember Jackie Gleason and the Honeymooners, besides me and Jerry and maybe a few other people? So one of the big laugh lines was when Jackie Gleason threatened his life, straight to the moon, Alice, because he was going to hit her. That was a laugh line. Media portrays violence against women as entertainment. This was something that happened in Fresno that maybe belongs in a different part of this thing. Fire chief, big budget cuts from the city because our city isn't doing any better than anybody else's city, got home and started beating his wife. His 18-year-old son jumped him, was trying to get him off, and eventually had to pepper spray him to get him off his mother. Man was arrested, taken into custody, and the next day, in spite of the recording on 911 being released to the public, his wife was defending him. He's no longer a fire chief. This isn't publicized like other crimes. So with apologies to Charles Dickens and his Tale of Two Cities, I'm going to give you a tale of two murders. It is Tuesday morning, after all. So everybody knows about this one. Jasper, Texas, James Byrd was walking down the street, got offered a ride by three guys. He knew one of them. They took him behind the local 7-Eleven, beat him up, tied a chain around his waist, and dragged him behind the pickup truck. Mr. Byrd died when his head and arm were ripped off when his body hit a culvert. Body was dumped at the local black cemetery. They went on to a barbecue to celebrate. Two of the victims were known members of a white supremacist group. They all three got convicted in short order, 1 year, actually 6 months. Two were sentenced to death and one to life in prison, and one's already been executed. Relatively swift in justice. In 2006, the naked body of a woman was found on a road in a subdivision outside of Denver. She'd been dragged behind a Toyota Corolla for a long distance with a tow rope around her neck. And the newsprint said leaving a trail of blood and tire marks. And let me be more specific. They were unable to clean the road. They had to re-asphalt it to get the stains out. Fingerprints were used to make the ID. She was Luz Maria Franco Fierro. She was an undocumented worker working 3 jobs trying to support her daughters back in Mexico. The guy she lived with did it, and he eventually took a plea deal, life in prison without parole. So, Mr. Bird, and I won't say that what happened to Mr. Bird wasn't horrible, terrible, awful, very bad, etc. Don't misunderstand me. Over 5 million stories. Crime denounced by national civil rights leaders. Foundation for Racial Healing started in his name. Movie on Showtime. Documentary on PBS. The Texas state legislature passed a Hate Crimes Act. Response. Ms. Franco Fierros, 468 stories initially, now about 300,000. No impassioned condemnation by any civil rights leader. No foundation, no made-for-TV movie, no documentaries, no legislation. There was an online collection for funeral costs so her body could be repatriated back to Mexico so her daughters could put flowers on her grave. Little bit different. So TV and movies include stalking, murder, and rape relatively regularly. And just as an FYI, Dr. Farmer, if any of your faculty get asked, I Googled movies and rape on the hospital computer, which got an interesting call from IT and a few other things. 204 million entries in less than half a second. 204 million, including one that has a website that says the best, most brutal, free, real rape movies on the internet, as if this is somehow supposed to be entertaining. So they did a study, social services kind of journal. They took 2 groups of men. They exposed one group of men to films that portrayed violence against women and sexual content, and then studied them over a week of watching this stuff. And the stuff that they said, this is awful and degrading, and by the end of the week, not so bad. Not so bad. Less anxiety about watching this. I felt terrible when I first saw these, and now not so much. And in fact, the more I watched, the more I enjoyed it. Seems ridiculous, but there you go. So they then took these 2 groups and they had them watch a mock rape trial and then surveyed them how they felt about it. And by the end of a week, the guys that had watched these movies felt that the woman that was raped was less injured and had less empathy toward rape victims in general. They repeated it with women and got the same results. Yeah, it is disgusting. So the entertainment industry argues that it's not real violence. It has no effect on behavior. Come on, guys. You know this isn't real. Why are you getting so upset about it? Anybody know what a 30-second ad at the Super Bowl last month was? $5 million. In 30 seconds, I can convince you which brand of tortilla chip to eat, which beer to swill while you're eating tortilla chips, and which ED pill is going to make you more attractive after you've been eating tortilla chips and swilling beer. $5 million for 30 seconds. But a 2-hour movie has no effect on your behavior? So, I'm not going to talk about the Kill Bill series. You guys can do that. Anybody know what that is? Anybody remember that movie? Did anybody see the 300? Yeah. Spartans' epic stand at Thermopylae, 300 Spartans and a bunch of Athenians stood against the Persian army, blah, blah, blah. I assure you, nobody was dressed like that at Thermopylae. So as the Spartan queen was trying to convince the opposition leader of the Senate to go rescue her husband, she was forced into sex, and the quote, "This will not be over soon and you will not enjoy this," is how they're advertising this movie. Really? So, bunch of movies with domestic violence in them. I'm going to talk about a vignette from the Bucket List where they're both sitting on the pyramid and the Jack Nicholson character said, yeah, the guy that his daughter married hit her, and he found out about it and he did what any dad would do. He called the guy who handles these things. Yeah. So this blacked out box, because this is, the Grand Rounds talk, is from Grand Theft Auto 4. And what a threesome has to do with stealing cars, I have no response. I have no idea. They sold 6 million copies in the first week and over 25 million total the last time I looked. There was an NPR discussion about it. And it's classic. Somebody from a university department of psychology on violence in the media, and somebody from the entertainment industry. Not a great discussion until a woman called in and said, my husband bought this game. And he goes and he plays it for 3 hours. And he walks out of where he plays it. And I don't like the way he talks to me, and I don't like the way he treats me after he does it. And I'm going home and I'm throwing away the game. Longitudinal study of young adults over 15 years stratified by do you watch a lot of violence on TV or little violence on TV. Those who watched a lot of violence, significantly more likely to have committed an act of intimate partner violence than those that didn't. 3 times more likely to be convicted of crimes. So to suggest that violence in the media contributes may be controversial, but I don't think it's far-fetched. So professional sports, and I'm winding down on time, so I'm going to hurry a little bit. Sports are more violent, they get special treatment. Kobe Bryant was heard to complain that when he was going from Los Angeles to Colorado for his felony rape trial, that the Learjet the Lakers provided him with was not appointed nicely enough. I'd have been embarrassed. But. So, Mike Vick, everybody remembers Mike Vick. This might be photoshopped. Mike Vick was involved in a pit bull fighting ring, convicted of animal cruelty, spent 21 months in prison, couldn't go back to Atlanta, was traded to Philly, burned in effigy. What a horrible human being. He shouldn't be allowed to live. He was involved in killing dogs. Now, I love dogs. These are the 3 most spoiled children on the planet, my two real kids and my furry kid. I love dogs. However, they're dogs. This guy, also in the NFL, shoved his pregnant fiance's head through a windshield. He got arrested multiple times, and the NFL never suspended him for a game. Not one time. It's a book, the criminals, the pros and cons, the criminals that played in the NFL. And they basically looked at every opening roster, and 20% had rap sheets. 20%. Rape, kidnapping, DUI, and homicide. Most common, IPV. O.J. Simpson, I'm not going to talk about. Chris Benoit was a pro wrestler who killed his entire family. Mike Pittman was a guy that played at Fresno State, and he was well known to Fresno PD. Multiple episodes of beating up his girlfriends. They swept it all under the rug so he could play on Saturday. He got to the NFL. He finally got charged 4 times for intimate partner violence, 30 or 40 more, according to his wife, that were never reported. And he finally got it because he rammed his Hummer into the car carrying his wife and baby girl repeatedly until somebody showed up. And that was what finally got him arrested. And he got a 3-game suspension. So surgeons are not unique. That's Dr. Carey, who was chairman of surgery at the University of South Florida, and he deserves what I'm about to say. So there was a surgical resident at the University of South Florida who threatened a nurse after she broke up with him. And his quote was, "What caliber bullet hole do you want in your head?" Dana, how would that go in your department?
No comment.
Okay. So the nurse came to me. I was pretty alarmed. It was my first year at USF. And the next day was the resident review. And I reported it. I said, this is a problem, and I don't know what we do here, but does this guy get put on probation? Does he have mandatory counseling? Do we just fire him? What do we do? And Larry said, mind your own business, Jim. Surgeons are mavericks. So celebrities have been in the news a lot. Chris Brown witnessed his mom's abuse by his stepmother and had a really interesting interview prior to all this happening where he said, it was so horrible, I grew up watching this and I never want to be involved in that. Okay, so this is a little bit of audience participation, please. Any idea? Yeah, that's because it's way before your time. This is the drummer from Guns N' Roses. Let's try again. Anybody got this guy? Stone Cold Steve Austin, pro wrestler, sometime actor, and a multiple-time loser. Old guy. Anybody know who this is? Gary Busey. Gary Busey's famous, man. Gary Busey had 2 motorcycle crashes with closed head injury in the ICU and was an anti-helmet activist. Because everybody ought to have the opportunity to have your brain get the wind whistling through it. And arrested for DV multiple times. Dr. Dre. Ooh, okay. Anybody know this guy? Vanilla Ice. Yeah. So, 3-time loser for domestic violence and 4 times if you count his rap career. Anybody know who this is? Come on, residents, your age group. This is Emma Roberts, Julia Roberts' niece. We're the Millers, American Horror Story. Beat up her boyfriend in Canada. Chris Albrecht used to be the CEO of Home Box Office. He was arrested for assaulting his girlfriend. He stepped down, air quotes, 2 days after the arrest. Never to be heard of again. I don't know, this may be the wrong age group for this one. I know. Yeah. When you're rolling with Yanni, you're rolling with a bad mofo. You gotta watch him. Colonel Sherman T. Potter from MASH. So, bunch of celebs associated with domestic violence. The ones in Cyan were on the receiving end, obviously. And I do this not to pick on wealthy people. I want to drive home the point that the race, creed, color, educational status, amount of money in your bank account is not protective. If I ask you to think about what happened on September 11th, you can close your eyes and picture the tower smoking, right? 3,000 people died. Every year in India, about 106,000 women are immolated in their kitchens over disputes about dowry or just plain domestic violence. And they're all written off as kitchen accidents. 100,000 a year. This guy is not a nice guy. 2017 signed a law easing the penalties for domestic violence. The estimate of women killed in Russia is preposterously low. So this guy was a city councilman in Carlsbad, New Mexico, and he put a Facebook post up after the Women's March. Women do have rights. They have a right to cook and clean. Stop your bitching and protesting. The playoffs are on, because you also have a right to get slapped. Really? That's a leader. Joe Biden is not a perp. Okay, before any of you go, oh, well, Joe Biden. Joe Biden's a hero. If you know a woman, have ever cared about a woman in your life, you should be in favor of Joe Biden, because he wrote the National Violence Against Women Act back in 1994. What that does is enhances a bunch of stuff for enforcement, improves services for shelters, does a lot of stuff. Unfortunately, it was allowed to lapse in the last Congress. And why? Because it enhanced protection for Native American women, and they were concerned that the tribal police would have too much authority. That was it. So we get back to the index case. My mom, bright, well-educated, got her PhD, was actually chair of psychology at Fresno State University for a number of years. The facial reconstruction story is sort of interesting, or at least it's interesting to me. Mom wasn't home for dinner one night, and my brother and I asked where she was, and she was at the university getting ready at a research meeting. Not there the next morning. Oh, she's in a study group. The story kept changing, and finally it came out that they'd been going down the road. A dog had run out in front of the car, and her second husband had been forced to slam on the brakes. She wasn't wearing her seatbelt. She face planted into the metal dashboard of the '63 Oldsmobile. But Mom wasn't at the local hospital. She was in Des Moines, Iowa, 35 miles away from the hospital where she'd initially been screened for her rib fractures. So my brother and I didn't actually talk about it. And I don't PTSD, whatever. But we both went out to the car at the same time and looked. And there was not a drop of blood on the dashboard or on the seats or on the upholstery, nothing. Mom didn't remember. So the rest of the story is child abuse occurs in 59% of the wife abuse families. And we weren't the 40%. My brother got his nose broken, has a scar on his face to this day. I can remember where I was when I got beaten up. Excuse me, I'm getting a little adrenaline flush right now, and please restrain me if the guy should happen to wander through the door. Domestic violence is an under-recognized recurrent part of trauma. At least 1 in 5 women reporting to your emergency department, at least 1 in 5, and probably more than that. We screw up. We don't make the diagnosis. So for God's sakes, please screen. And why don't we screen? Because we're really uncomfortable with what to do. Okay? It's icky. It's bad. Now what the hell do we do? I know how to fix a spleen or take it out, but what do I do with this? And the answer is you don't have to do a lot. You have to make the diagnosis and take care of the patient, and your social services people have it dialed in with what to do next. Just make the damn diagnosis. Okay? Trauma PI process ought to include screening for this. We screen everybody at my hospital. And part of your PI process should be to find out if you did, and if you didn't, why not? And ongoing education on this on an annual basis. If you suspect non-accidental trauma in a child, screen the mom, for God's sake. 60% of the time it'll be positive. Cooperate with law enforcement. Okay, and California is a mandatory reporting state. Collaborate for injury prevention and support your local shelter. If you want to know how big the check should be, when you write it and sign your name, it should feel like you just passed a kidney stone, because it ought to be that damn big. Can you imagine a woman that finally gets the courage to leave, shows up at a shelter, and gets turned away because it's so full? When I started giving this talk, there was 1 shelter in Fresno. There are now 3, and they're always full. So, screening and brief intervention was adopted for alcohol as a requirement 12 years ago by the American College of Surgeons. Victims of domestic violence deserve no less. I am on my 4th COT chair since I started giving this talk back in 2008. Eileen Bulger's great. She's at the University of Washington. She's a really, really neat woman. That's her email address. If this talk meant anything to you, please email her and ask her, why aren't we requiring mandatory screening for domestic violence as part of the COT PI criteria? I'm sure she'll love to hear from you. And I'm not worried because I'm capped out. I'm not going up anymore, so it doesn't matter. So I dedicate this. That's Mom. I won't say anything more about that. Interestingly enough, my wife was abused by a boyfriend and put a scar on her arm. And she broke up with him immediately. He wanted to talk to her. She met him someplace. He jumped in her car and drove around San Diego for an hour describing how he was going to kill her. And eventually he parked the car and threw her keys off the cliff into the ocean, but didn't hit her again. I would never have given this talk without her. How many have daughters? So you'll totally get this slide. Right? So I still see her like that. She doesn't look like that anymore. And she used to say, when can I date, Dad? And I said, when you have straight A's and a black belt. And I lost both those things. So that's Half Dome, which is about 60 miles up the road from me. I thank you for your time and attention, and if we have time, I'll take questions or comments. Or
It's hard to know after such a profound talk like that exactly what to say, except that I think it's a reminder for everything we do that there is always the opportunity to do better. And thank you for giving us a real action plan in terms of, communicating with Eileen and making this happen. Because as everybody knows here, Sacramento is not very much different than Fresno in terms of the amount of this kind of thing that we see, and we can do better here as well. And I think I really, our trauma leadership is here, and to think about how we can roll this in. The comment about screening women for all of our children, of what Joe and I have written against calling non-accidental trauma. I have the same feeling about intimate partner violence. Yeah, it's abuse, it's torture, it's murder, and we put nice, politically correct words around it so that we can talk about it more easily. But I think that interferes with, the reality of what we're really talking about.
And I have to say, Chris Kokenauer is the chair of the Best Practice Guidelines Committee on Abuse and has done really great leadership in that group and needs to be recognized.
Chris, why don't we let you have our last comment since we're running out of time?
A couple of things. One, the best practice guideline that should be out next November is when we are hoping to be able to present at the people meeting.
Stand up.
It will be abuse. It will be child abuse, elder abuse, intimate partner violence, and it's not going to be called non-accidental trauma. That's one thing. The other thing is there are PI guidelines that will cover all three areas, and one of the things that's going to be recommended is to keep like a PI thing that hopefully is shared with this committee and with the ERC. We can get it as a part of the next iteration of we'll go to whatever color book is going to be, that there will be requirements.
Great work, and thank you.
Thanks for having me.